The scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the small roadside diner. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world outside felt distant, and the only sounds were the soft hum of an old radio and the occasional clatter of plates. Ramon wiped his hands on his apron and glanced at the clock, almost closing time. He had spent the last 3 years working at Willow's Diner, serving truckers, travelers, and the occasional local who needed a late-night meal. Tonight felt no different. Then, the bell above the door chimed. He turned, expecting to see a familiar face, but instead, his eyes landed on a woman he didn't recognize, yet something about her felt oddly familiar. She was in a wheelchair, her hands resting lightly on the wheels as she maneuvered herself inside. A worn-out coat draped over her thin frame, and her silver hair was tucked beneath a faded hat. But what caught Ramon's attention wasn't her appearance, it was the way she stared directly at him. There was intent in her gaze, a silent message that he couldn't quite decipher. For a moment, he stood frozen. Why did she feel so familiar? She rolled herself to a booth in the farthest corner, away from the warmth of the main seating area. Ramon swallowed the unease creeping up his spine and walked over, notebook in hand. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, forcing a polite smile. "What can I get for you?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if she were studying him, trying to decide something. "Coffee," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "Black." Ramon nodded and stepped away, but he could feel her eyes following him. As he poured the coffee, his hands trembled slightly. Why did she feel so familiar? He knew every regular who came through the diner, and he was certain she wasn't one of them. Yet, a part of him knew this wasn't the first time their paths had crossed. He returned to the table and set the coffee down. "Anything else?" She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth sink into her fingers before answering. "You don't remember me, do you?" Ramon blinked, his stomach tightening. There it was. A question that confirmed his growing suspicion, he should know her. I'm not sure," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Have we met before?" The woman didn't reply. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out something small, folded, and slightly crumpled. A newspaper clipping. She placed it gently on the table and slid it toward him. Ramon hesitated. There was something about the way she did it, careful, deliberate, almost as if she was handing him a piece of his own past. With a deep breath, he picked it up and unfolded it. His heart stopped. The headline jumped out at him, bold and unshakable. "Missing boy found under mysterious circumstances, no memory of his past." Ramon's vision blurred. His fingers tightened around the paper as his pulse pounded in his ears. He had seen this article before. Because the missing boy in the picture was him. His hands trembled, and he slowly lifted his gaze to the woman sitting across from him. She was watching him, waiting, as if she already knew what was going through his mind. And then, she whispered the words that sent a chill down his spine. "We need to talk. It's about what really happened that night." The newspaper clipping felt heavier than it should have, like it carried a weight beyond just ink and paper. Ramon stared at the photograph, his own face, much younger, staring back at him with wide, vacant eyes. His breath came in shallow gasps. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. This had to be a mistake. I don't understand," he muttered. The woman in the wheelchair said nothing at first. She let the silence stretch between them, as if waiting for him to catch up to a truth she already knew. Finally, she spoke. "You don't remember, do you?" Ramon forced himself to look at her. Her eyes weren't just watching him, they were studying him. "I don't," he hesitated. "I mean, I know about this story. But that was decades ago." She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. 23 years, to be exact. 23 years. Ramon felt the number settle in his chest, pressing down like a weight. He had been found alone in the middle of the woods, confused and disoriented, with no memory of how he got there. The authorities had tried to piece together what had happened, but no answers ever came. Eventually, the world moved on. And so did he. Or at least, he thought he had. I don't see what this has to do with you, he said carefully. The woman exhaled slowly. Because I was there that night too. Ramon's pulse skipped. He searched her face for any hint of deception, but she was completely serious. You were there, he repeated, barely above a whisper. She nodded. And I know what really happened. The room felt too small all of a sudden. The diner, the hum of the radio, the clinking of dishes in the background, it all blurred, like the edges of his reality were fraying. Ramon swallowed. What do you mean? The woman's gaze hardened. I mean, the story they told you, the one you've believed your entire life, is a lie. A chill ran down his spine. No, he said instinctively, shaking his head. That doesn't make sense. The police found me. They did an investigation. No one knew where I came from, but no one asked the right questions, she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. No one looked deep enough. They assumed you were just a lost child who couldn't remember what happened. But I know the truth, Ramon. He flinched at the way she said his name. His mind raced. He had tried to remember what happened before that night, but his past had always been a blur. No family, no records, no memories before the age of 7. His first memory was being found. But now, this stranger was sitting in front of him, telling him that everything he thought he knew was wrong. His hands clenched into fists. How do you know all this? He demanded. The woman took a slow sip of her coffee, unfazed by his growing tension. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, but it carried weight. Because I saw them take you. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He froze. Take me? She nodded. And I saw what they left behind. Ramon's breathing grew unsteady. This isn't real. This isn't happening. But the look in her eyes told him otherwise. His entire life, he had never questioned his past too much. There had always been gaps, things that didn't quite add up, but he convinced himself it didn't matter. Now, for the first time, he wondered, what if he had been too afraid to look? His voice was unsteady when he spoke again. Who are you? The woman gave a sad smile. Someone who has been waiting a long time for you to remember. Ramon shook his head. No, this doesn't make sense. Why now? Why come to me after all these years? Her expression darkened. Because they're coming back, Ramon. The world seemed to tilt. He swallowed. Who? The woman leaned forward. The ones who took you. The diner suddenly felt too quiet. Ramon's entire body tensed. This was crazy. This was insane. And yet, deep inside, something stirred. Something he couldn't quite explain. Because as unbelievable as this sounded, some part of him already knew it was true. Ramon sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. The diner around him was eerily quiet, the soft buzz of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of the evening outside somehow muted, as if the world had fallen away. He stared at the woman across from him, his chest tightening with confusion. They're coming back, he repeated, his voice barely audible. The woman nodded again, her gaze unwavering. Her eyes were full of something deeper than mere knowledge. She was offering him something, but it wasn't hope. It was a warning. Yes. And they'll be looking for you. Ramon's stomach lurched. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to believe it. After all these years of living a quiet, normal life, the idea that his past was about to come crashing down felt like a cruel joke. But as much as he tried to dismiss it, something about her words hit too close to home. His mind raced back to that night, the night he was found in the woods, disoriented, unable to remember his life before then. It felt like an old wound, one he had buried deep, never daring to open it again. "I've spent my whole life trying to forget," he muttered, his voice shaky. What if it's just some weird coincidence?" The woman shook her head slowly, a sad smile pulling at the corners of her lips. "I wish it were. But you know deep down that it isn't." Ramon clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. The words hit too close to the truth. He knew. He knew that something had always felt off. The gap in his memories, the silence that stretched before the moment he was found, it had never made sense. People had called him a miracle, a lost boy who had somehow survived the impossible. But now, the words didn't sound comforting. They felt like a lie. "You say you were there," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "What happened that night? What did they do to me?" The woman didn't flinch. "You were part of something much bigger than you realize. Something that was never meant to be discovered." Ramon leaned forward, desperate for answers, his mind in turmoil. "Who were they?" The woman's expression shifted. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Then, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "They were not human. Not entirely." Ramon recoiled, almost laughing in disbelief. Not human? This was insane. But then, something in her gaze, the absolute certainty with which she spoke, made his laughter fade. Her eyes weren't the eyes of a crazy person. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things that couldn't be explained. Things that changed everything. "Explain," he demanded, his voice rising now. "Explain what you mean. What do you know about me? About my past?" The woman took a deep breath and let it out slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup absent-mindedly. "I can't tell you everything yet," she said, almost regretfully. "Not until you're ready. But I can tell you this, you were chosen for a reason." Ramon stared at her, his mind reeling. "Chosen?" "Yes." She paused, locking eyes with him. "They needed something from you. And when they couldn't get it, they erased your memory. But it's all coming back. Slowly, but it's coming." Ramon swallowed hard. His thoughts churned in confusion, but there was one thing that stood out: she knew things that no one should know. He could feel it in his gut. But there was still a question nagging at him, one he had to ask. "Why did you come to me now? Why wait all these years?" The woman's face hardened. "Because now they know you're still alive. And they've been looking for you ever since." Ramon sat back, the blood draining from his face. A chill ran down his spine. "They've been looking for me," he repeated. His voice was hoarse now. "Yes," she said. "You were meant to be part of something greater. But when it went wrong, they had to hide you away. And when they thought they lost you, they stopped looking. But why now?" Ramon asked again, his voice quiet, almost afraid of the answer. "Because," she said, her voice softening. "They didn't count on you remembering." Ramon felt a strange sensation, a flicker of something deep within his mind, a pull, an almost magnetic force, that made him feel like he was remembering something. But the harder he tried to focus on it, the more it slipped away, like trying to grasp onto smoke. "Something is waking up inside you, Ramon," the woman said, her voice grave. "It's time for you to remember. And when you do, the world will never be the same." Ramon's breath caught in his throat. What did she mean? The questions were stacking up, and every answer she gave only created more. The woman leaned forward now, her eyes hard with resolve. "You have two choices," she said, her voice calm but filled with an urgency that made Ramon's heart race. "You can keep pretending that everything is normal, that you can continue with your quiet life. Or you can face the truth. But they're coming. And when they find you, there's no going back." Ramon felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His thoughts were scattered, but the truth was becoming clearer. He wasn't just a lost boy. He had been chosen for something far beyond his comprehension. And now, the past he had tried to forget was coming for him again. Ramon sat frozen, his thoughts spinning out of control. Every word the woman spoke seemed to echo in his mind, each one unlocking a door to a past he didn't want to remember. But no matter how hard he tried to shut it out, the truth was slipping through the cracks, and he was terrified of what lay behind it. "They're not human," he whispered, as though saying it out loud might make the words lose their power. The woman nodded, her expression grim. "No. There's something else entirely. Something much older and far more dangerous than you can imagine." Ramon's chest tightened. He had always thought of his life as normal, boring even. The routine of his job at the diner, the simple pleasures of working in a quiet town, it had all felt safe. He never questioned it. But now, sitting across from a woman who knew far too much about his life, he felt like everything he knew was unraveling before him. "Why didn't they take me back then?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence that had enveloped them. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because you were too important to them. They couldn't risk losing you." Ramon's mind raced. What did she mean? Before he could ask, she continued, her tone darkening. "They've been hiding in plain sight, manipulating events, pulling strings behind the scenes. They created the perfect cover-up to hide what really happened that night, to erase you from the world." He shook his head, trying to make sense of it. The night he was found, the story he had been told, everything felt false now. How could it have been a cover-up? Why him? "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice rising with frustration. "I don't understand any of this. What do they want from me?" The woman leaned forward, her eyes intent on his. "They need you, Ramon. They've always needed you. The event that happened that night, it was meant to awaken something in you. Something that had been dormant. But they failed. They didn't account for what happened when they took you." Ramon's heart thudded in his chest. Awaken something? What was she talking about? "You're not like everyone else," she said softly, almost as though speaking to herself. "They knew that. That's why they took you. That's why they erased your memories. They wanted to control you. But they couldn't." Ramon sat back in his chair, feeling suddenly drained. Control him? How? The woman met his eyes, her gaze unwavering. "You were part of a much bigger plan. They were using you, using your ability. Something inside you that they thought they could manipulate. But they made a mistake, Ramon. They underestimated you." The words hit him like a physical blow. He felt a sharp pang in his chest as if something had just shifted deep within him. For the first time, he felt like he was on the edge of something he couldn't fully grasp. He needed to understand, but every answer only led to more questions. "And now?" he asked, barely able to keep his voice steady. "What happens now?" "They'll be coming for you soon," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "They'll stop at nothing to take you back." The room seemed to close in around him. He looked at the woman, seeing the fear in her eyes for the first time. She wasn't just warning him, she was trying to save him. But save him from what? Ramon's mind raced. What had he been a part of? What was this hidden truth about him? Before he could voice another question, the woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, metallic object. She held it out to him, the light from the diner's old lamps catching on its sleek surface. "This is what they wanted," she said, her voice low. "This is what they were after. Ramon stared at the object in her hand. It looked like a simple device, but there was something about it that felt unnatural. It shimmered faintly, as though it was alive. "What is it?" he asked, taking a cautious step toward it. The woman nodded toward the object. "It's part of the reason they came for you. It's part of the power they thought they could harness. But you were never supposed to have it." Ramon reached for it slowly, as though afraid it might burn him. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a jolt of energy coursed through him, and his vision blurred for a split second. He gasped, pulling his hand back. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The woman looked at him with a knowing expression. "You felt it, didn't you? That's what's inside you. That's the power they were trying to awaken." Ramon felt dizzy, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. "This is insane," he muttered, his hands shaking. "I don't know what to believe anymore." The woman's gaze softened. "You don't have to understand it all right now. But you do need to know this: you're not just some lost boy. You never were. You were part of something bigger." Ramon's thoughts were a whirlwind. Could it be true? Could he really have some hidden power inside him? And if so, why had it been dormant for so long? As the weight of her words settled in, he realized there was no turning back now. The truth had been laid before him, and whether he accepted it or not, his life was about to change forever. But the biggest question remained: who were these people, and what did they want with him? Ramon's mind was reeling, 100 thoughts running in every direction, none of them fully making sense. The device that had sparked something in him, the cryptic words of the woman in the wheelchair, it all felt like a fever dream, too unreal to be true. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been woken up inside him. He stared at the metallic object in his hands, the smooth surface still humming with the strange energy that had coursed through him just moments ago. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever felt, a sharp clarity, a heightened awareness, as though his mind was suddenly tuned into frequencies it had never known existed. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why is it making me feel like this?" The woman's eyes didn't leave his, her expression unreadable. "That is part of what they wanted. It's not just a device, Ramon. It's part of you. You're connected to it in ways that neither of us fully understand, yet." Ramon's hands shook slightly as he set the device down on the table, still trying to grasp the implications of her words. Could it really be true? Could this thing, this small, seemingly insignificant object, hold the key to something he had never known about himself? "I don't get it," he muttered. "What does this all mean? Why me?" The woman took a deep breath, her gaze softening with what almost looked like pity. "Because you were born with something they needed, something they could control. They thought they could manipulate it, make you an instrument of their will." "Who?" Ramon interrupted, his voice rising in frustration. "Who are they? Why have I never known any of this?" "They're part of a group, Ramon. A group that has been manipulating human history from the shadows for centuries. And you were one of their greatest mistakes." The weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. A secret group controlling history? It sounded insane, but deep down, in the pit of his stomach, he felt it. There was something familiar about it, something he couldn't quite explain. "Their mistake?" Ramon repeated, still struggling to catch his breath. "How was I their mistake?" "Because they didn't account for your resistance." The woman's lips curled into a tight smile. "They couldn't control you like they thought. When they tried to erase your memories, they didn't expect your mind to fight back. They thought you would be their puppet, but you've been fighting them from the moment you woke up in that forest." Ramon's heart skipped a beat. Fighting them? How could he have been fighting something he didn't even remember? He had always felt like an outsider, like something didn't quite fit with his past. "Then why am I just now remembering?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Because they've been keeping you hidden, she said, her tone turning grave. They thought if they kept you in the dark, you wouldn't realize your true potential. But now, she paused, as if considering her next words carefully. Now that they know you're starting to remember, they're coming for you. Ramon felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The woman was right, there was no denying it anymore. He wasn't just a random person. He wasn't some lost child found in the woods. There was a purpose behind all of this, a plan that involved him, one he had been kept in the dark about. But how do I stop them? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. What can I do? She looked at him with a deep sadness in her eyes. You can't stop them alone, Ramon. You need help. You need to find the others. The ones like you. Others like me? Ramon repeated. What do you mean? The woman leaned forward, her voice lowering to a near whisper. You're not the only one. There are others out there who were also part of their experiments. But most of them have been lost, hidden, forgotten. It's up to you to find them, and together, you might just stand a chance. Ramon felt his chest tighten with the weight of her words. Others like him? How many were there? Where were they? And how did he even begin to find them? Before he could ask more questions, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small card, barely larger than a business card, and slid it across the table to him. This is a start, she said. It's the contact for one of the others. She's been waiting for you. Ramon picked up the card, turning it over in his hands. There was only a name and a phone number written on it, nothing more. But... Ramon began, his voice shaking, how do I know I can trust her? You'll have to trust your instincts, Ramon, she replied, her gaze unwavering. You're the one who can make the difference now. You're the key. But you have to be ready to embrace it. Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for the first time in his life, Ramon wondered if he was truly ready for what was about to come. Are you ready to face the truth? She asked softly. Ramon looked at the card in his hand, then back at her. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, it all rushed through him in that moment. But beneath it all, something else stirred, something new. Something that had always been there, waiting for him to acknowledge it. Yes, he said quietly. I'm ready. The woman nodded, her eyes filled with approval. Then it begins. Ramon stood up, his mind spinning with everything he had just learned. The road ahead was uncertain, dangerous, and filled with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, he was no longer just a lost boy. He was part of something much larger, something that could change everything. The truth had been uncovered, and now, there was no turning back. Ramon stood by the table, staring down at the card in his hand. The name printed on it, Amara Halstead, meant nothing to him, but everything at the same time. It was a thread, a lifeline to a world he hadn't known existed. And now, it was his only way forward. As he pocketed the card, his mind spun with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. The woman in the wheelchair had given him a path, but it wasn't a safe one. The others were out there, waiting for him, and with them came the truth, the real truth, about who he was. But none of that mattered now. Because, for the first time in his life, he realized that time was running out. They'll be here soon, the woman said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. And when they come, they won't stop until they've found you. The words cut through the air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Ramon swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic in his chest. Who are they? He demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. What do they want with me? The woman's eyes hardened. They're not human, Ramon. And they've been watching you for years. They know what you are. They'll stop at nothing to get you back. The air in the diner suddenly felt too thick, like it was closing in on him. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't just sit here and wait for them to find him. His mind raced. There had to be a way out. You have to leave, the woman said, her voice urgent. They'll be tracking you. You have to go before it's too late. Ramon nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. The idea of running, of leaving behind everything he had known, terrified him, but it was the only option. He couldn't let these people, these things, take him back. Not after everything he had learned. Where do I go? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman looked at him with a strange intensity. Find Amara. She'll know what to do. She's the only one who can help you now. Without another word, she turned and wheeled herself toward the door, her eyes never leaving him. Ramon followed her lead, slipping out of the diner and into the night, his every sense on high alert. The street was quiet, too quiet. The headlights of a passing car cast long, ghostly shadows across the pavement, and the wind picked up, sending a chill down his spine. It felt like the calm before a storm. Ramon glanced over his shoulder, half expecting someone to be watching him from the shadows. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had to get to Amara. As he rounded the corner, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and checked the screen, an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, he answered. Hello? He said, trying to keep his voice steady. For a moment, there was nothing but static on the line. Then, a voice cut through the silence. You're running out of time. Ramon froze. The voice was low, gravelly, and unmistakably human, yet there was something wrong with it. It didn't sound quite right. You think you've escaped, but we're already on your tail. Ramon's breath caught in his throat. Who is this? The voice chuckled darkly. We've been watching you for a long time, Ramon. Don't think you can hide from us. You're ours. The line went dead. Ramon's hands shook as he lowered the phone, the weight of the words sinking in. They knew. They were already looking for him. They were coming. He had to move faster. He had to find Amara. The quiet of the night was suddenly shattered by the sound of an engine, a car, revving its engine in the distance. Ramon's heart raced. His instincts screamed at him to run. They were here. Ramon sprinted down the street, his legs pumping, his mind a blur of panic and determination. The car's engine grew louder, and he knew they were gaining on him. He had no idea who they were, or what they wanted, but one thing was clear, they were not going to stop. He ducked into an alley, trying to lose himself in the maze of narrow streets and shadows. The city was alive with the hum of distant traffic, but it felt like the world around him was closing in. He had to think. Amara, he muttered under his breath, his mind racing. He had to find her, and fast. She was his only chance. He didn't have time to waste. Every second felt like it could be his last. With a final glance behind him, Ramon turned the corner and made his way toward the address on the card. He had no idea who Amara was, or how she could help, but there was no other choice. He had to trust her. But as he ran, one thought gnawed at him, deep in his gut: what if he was already too late? Ramon's breath came in quick, ragged gasps as his feet pounded the pavement. The alley was narrow, dark, and filled with the smell of damp concrete. He didn't dare look behind him, but he could hear the car getting closer, the sound of its engine, that low, almost predatory growl, sending shivers down his spine. They were right on his tail. He had to get to Amara. He had to get to her before they caught him. His heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts a blur. Who were they? Why were they after him? The woman in the wheelchair had said they weren't human. But what did that even mean? Not human? It didn't make sense. His mind couldn't make sense of any of it, but what he knew with complete certainty was that they wanted him back. He turned another corner and ducked into a narrow side street, glancing over his shoulder. The headlights of the car cut through the darkness like a predator's gaze, and Ramon's blood ran cold. He pushed himself harder, running faster despite the stitch in his side. No time to stop. His fingers brushed against his pocket, where the card with Amara's contact lay. It felt like his only connection to safety, to answers, but he knew he couldn't stop to look at it now. There would be no point if they caught him. The streetlights flickered as he ran, their yellow glow casting long, eerie shadows. He felt like he was being swallowed whole by the darkness, like the city itself was conspiring against him. His legs burned, and his breath came faster, but he couldn't stop. The car was gaining on him. He reached an intersection and glanced up, scanning for any sign of Amara. There were no cars in sight, no sign of anyone following him, except for the engine that seemed to be creeping ever closer. He needed a way out. He needed a plan. Then, he saw it. A small door tucked between two buildings, barely visible unless you were looking for it. A small alley. Without thinking, he darted toward it, hoping it led to something, anything that might help him get away. He heard the screech of tires behind him, the unmistakable sound of the car making a sharp turn onto the same street. His heart raced as he pushed himself harder, not caring about the pain in his legs. He had to reach that door. Finally, he reached it and yanked it open. The door creaked, the old wood protesting, but he didn't hesitate. He slipped inside, feeling the immediate change in temperature as he stepped into the shadowy interior of what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. The door slammed shut behind him. He stood in the dark, gasping for breath. He could still hear the car outside, its engine revving, searching for him. But the street was quiet again, and the sound slowly faded. For a moment, Ramon stood absolutely still, listening intently, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The silence around him was deafening. Then, from the darkness ahead, a voice cut through the quiet. "Ramon, right?" Ramon froze. His pulse raced, every nerve on edge. His body tensed, ready to run. But then he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the shadows. A woman appeared, stepping into the dim light filtering through a cracked window. She was tall, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she wore dark clothes, blending seamlessly into the shadows around her. "You're Ramon, aren't you?" she asked again, her voice smooth, confident. Ramon took a cautious step back. "Who are you?" She smiled, but there was something intense in her gaze, something that reminded him of the woman at the diner. The same certainty, the same calm authority. "Amara," she said, her voice firm and direct. "I've been waiting for you." The relief that flooded through Ramon was almost overwhelming. She was the one the woman had spoken of, the one he had to find. But as much as he felt a surge of hope, his mind was still clouded with questions. "Why didn't you answer my call earlier?" he asked, his voice sharp with frustration. Amara's smile faded slightly. "I couldn't risk it. They've been listening to you, watching you. They would have known you were coming." Ramon glanced toward the door, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if they were safe yet. "They're coming for me, aren't they?" Amara nodded, her expression serious. "Yes. They've been tracking you since you woke up. They're never far behind, and they won't stop until they've found you." Ramon's mind raced. Why him? What made him so important? "What do they want with me?" he asked, his voice desperate. Amara took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his. "They want control. They've always wanted control. And they believe that you hold the key to something they can't even fully understand. But you're the one who's been resisting them from the start." Ramon's confusion only deepened. "What do you mean, resisting? I don't even remember anything." Amara stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You don't need to remember, Ramon. What matters now is that you're starting to. Ramon felt his mind start to churn again, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He was starting to remember. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device, one that looked very much like the one the woman at the diner had shown him. This is the key to your past. And to your future. Ramon stared at it, his pulse quickening. What do I do with it? Amara's gaze softened. You'll know when the time is right. But right now, we have to move fast. The others are closing in. Ramon nodded, the fear and urgency in his chest settling into something else, something more determined. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting back. Ramon's heart hammered in his chest as Amara led him deeper into the abandoned warehouse. The sound of footsteps echoing off the walls was the only noise in the otherwise silent space. She moved quickly, her dark figure darting through the shadows, and Ramon instinctively followed her, his mind racing with everything he had learned so far. He barely noticed the walls of the warehouse, its cracked windows and old wooden beams. His focus was entirely on Amara and the small device she had shown him. What was its purpose? What was it supposed to unlock? You're starting to remember, aren't you? Amara's voice broke through his thoughts. Ramon nodded slowly, feeling a mixture of fear and awe. He was remembering things. Tiny flashes of images, feelings, and sounds were surfacing, pushing their way through the fog of his mind. Faces he couldn't place, events he had never fully understood, they were all starting to fit together. I don't know what to make of it all, he said, his voice shaky. I keep remembering flashes, but it's like they're just out of reach. It's all jumbled. Amara's eyes softened, but there was an edge of urgency in her voice. The memories will come when you need them most, Ramon. Trust me. They've been locked away for so long, and now they're starting to break through. That device, she nodded toward the small object he still clutched in his hand, was meant to keep them from resurfacing. But now, it's time to awaken the truth. Ramon looked at the device, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't understand how something so small could have such power, but everything about Amara's presence, her confidence, told him that this wasn't just about technology. It was about something much deeper. Something within him. Why did they hide it from me, he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Why couldn't I know the truth all this time? Amara paused, her face shadowed by the weight of the question. Because they needed you to be broken, Ramon. They needed you to forget so that you would be easier to control. They thought if they wiped your memory, you'd be nothing more than a tool in their hands. But you weren't, and that's why they've been hunting you all this time. Ramon stopped in his tracks, a sick feeling rising in his stomach. So, everything they did to me, was all part of their plan to make me into something? What exactly am I supposed to be? Amara turned, meeting his gaze with a solemn expression. You're not just a part of their plan, Ramon. You are the plan. The missing piece that will either break or remake everything. Ramon felt a chill run down his spine. What does that mean? What do I have that they want? Amara's voice dropped to a whisper. You were born with an ability they could never understand. When they found you, they saw it, the power within you, and they wanted to control it. But you're not like them, Ramon. You never were. And that's why they're terrified. The weight of her words settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked for any of this. But somehow, it was his reality now, his destiny. The one thing he knew for sure was that his past was a lie. And everything he thought he knew was about to be shattered. I don't want to be a weapon, he said, his voice low and pained. I don't want to be part of their plan. Amara stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're not a weapon, Ramon. You're a force. A force that can bring them down if you choose to. But first, you need to unlock everything they've kept from you. Ramon's heart raced. How do I do that? How do I unlock this power you're talking about? Amara turned and motioned to the far corner of the warehouse. There, hidden beneath a pile of old tarps and crates, was a door, small and unassuming. But as she moved toward it, something about it seemed significant. She turned the handle, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. "Come with me," she said, her voice steady but urgent. Ramon followed, his pulse quickening with every step. The darkness ahead seemed endless, but he couldn't stop now. The answers were down there, and no matter how terrified he was, he had to know the truth. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Amara flipped a switch on the wall. The room lit up, revealing a small chamber lined with strange equipment. In the center of the room, there was a large, metallic chair, its design clearly out of place, almost alien in appearance. It hummed with an energy that made the hairs on Ramon's neck stand on end. "This is where they tried to erase your memories," Amara said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is where they thought they could control you. But it's also where you'll unlock the rest of yourself." Ramon took a step forward, feeling drawn to the chair. Something inside him pulled him toward it, a force stronger than his fear. It was like his body already knew what to do, what was about to happen. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, his voice filled with doubt. Amara smiled, her gaze filled with understanding. "You don't have to do it alone. You've always had the power, Ramon. All you need to do now is embrace it." With those words, something clicked inside him. A rush of memory flooded back, visions, sensations, emotions that had been buried for so long. Faces, events, places, it was all coming back. But there was one thing that stood out above everything else. He wasn't just a boy. He wasn't just some experiment. He was something more. A force. And now, it was time to embrace that power. Ramon stood still, the weight of everything settling onto his shoulders as he faced the chair in front of him. The room hummed with energy, and in that moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Amara stood a few feet away, her presence calm but filled with an intensity that matched the gravity of the situation. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, her voice carrying a sense of understanding. "But if you do, everything will change." Ramon glanced at her, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Fear. Confusion. Doubt. But somewhere beneath it all, there was a flicker of something else, something stronger, something he couldn't quite name, but that felt like the truth. He knew he couldn't run anymore. He had spent his entire life trying to forget what had happened, trying to ignore the gaps in his memories, the feelings that he wasn't quite whole. But now, everything was coming together. He wasn't just a victim of some experiment. He wasn't just a pawn in their twisted game. He was the key. "Amara," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm ready." Amara nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet pride. She stepped aside, allowing him to approach the chair. As he walked forward, he could feel the pull of it, something deep inside him, something ancient and powerful, urging him forward. He sat down, and the moment he did, he felt an electric jolt run through his body, an undeniable connection to the strange energy in the room. The chair, the device, the memories, it was all part of him now, and he could feel it unlocking. His mind exploded with images, his past, his true purpose, the reason he had been chosen. Everything that had been hidden from him for so long was rushing back. He saw the faces of the people who had experimented on him, the moments of his life that had been erased. He saw the people who had abandoned him and the ones who had protected him. And in the center of it all, he saw himself. Not as a lost boy, but as a force beyond comprehension. The energy surged, and for a moment, everything went white. The memories, the emotions, the power, it all merged into a single truth that echoed in his mind. Ramon was not just a weapon. He was a catalyst. The woman in the wheelchair had been right. The memories had been locked away for a reason. The truth had been hidden from him because they were afraid of what he would become. They had tried to control him, but now, the power was his to command. He wasn't a puppet. He wasn't a tool. He was the one who could change everything. The surge of energy subsided, and Ramon opened his eyes, feeling different. Not just mentally, but physically, like his body was now attuned to the universe in ways he hadn't understood before. Amara was standing beside him, watching him closely. "You've unlocked it," she said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and something else, respect. Ramon stood, his mind racing but his body feeling stronger than it had ever been. He could feel the power, the connection, the knowledge of how to use it, how to fight back. "I didn't choose this," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "I didn't ask for any of this." Amara nodded, her expression understanding. "None of us do, Ramon. But sometimes, the universe chooses us anyway. And now, you're the one who can stop them." He looked at her, the weight of it all sinking in. The people who had taken him, who had tried to control him, they weren't just a shadow anymore. He could feel them, and he could fight them. The choice had been his all along. "Do you believe in fate?" Amara asked, her voice softer now. Ramon took a deep breath, the truth settling into his bones. "I do now." The room seemed to pulse with energy, as though the very walls recognized the change. He had stepped into his true self, the person he was always meant to be. And now, there was no turning back. The world was going to change, and he would be the one to shape it. "Then you know what you have to do," Amara said, her voice steady with conviction. "You know what's at stake. And you're ready." Ramon looked at the door, his heart pounding with the weight of everything. There was a war to fight, a truth to expose, and the future of everything rested in his hands. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't lost. He was free. And now, it was time to take back what was his. As he stepped out into the night, the world felt new, as though everything was possible. The past had been erased, but the future was wide open. This was only the beginning.